Well, hello everyone. Happy Easter. I hope you had a lovely time with your family and you're ready to get back into work, and I hope that this is a lovely way to get back into it. For those whom I haven't met, my name's Andrew Whitehouse. I'm the Chief Research Officer at the Autism CRC. I'm going to be hosting today's webinar, which is the first for our Autism Month webinar series within the Autism CRC. Over the following week, what we're going to be doing is holding a number of webinars, 4 in total, to improve our understanding about autism, as well as sharing some of the Autism CRC's latest research and outcomes across 3 programs: early years program, school years program, and adulthood. On Monday, the 29th of April, so that's this coming Monday, we have a session to hear the perspectives of autistic adults and what being autistic means to them and what they would like others to know about autism. Now, before we get started today, I'd just like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar, because we really do want to hear from you. Today's webinar is focused on the early years and diagnosis. We'd really like you to take the opportunity to submit text questions by typing your questions into the question pane of the go-to control panel. That's that chat pane down there. Once you can send in your questions at any time during the presentations, and what I'll do is I'll collate them during the presentation, and at the end, from about 3:20 to 3:30 Eastern Standard Time, which is about 1:20 to 1:30 Western Standard Time, and somewhere in between for Central, I will then have a bit of question time, and I'll put your questions to the panel. Today what we've done is we've brought together leading specialists to present Autism CRC's latest research and outcomes in the establishment of the Australian Autism Biobank, as well as the promise of neuroimaging tools and also some data with regards to successfully transitioning children from early intervention programs to mainstream primary schools. Today we're going to hear from Dr. Felicity Rose and Professor Valsamma Eapen, and we're really privileged to have them here, and thank you for their time as well. So, without further ado, I'll be introducing Felicity now. Felicity is our Autism CRC project coordinator and the administrator responsible for coordinating operations for Australia's first Autism Biobank. And I can tell you, just from a personal perspective, Felicity is one of the godmothers of the Biobank, both in idea and execution. So we owe a great deal of thanks to Felicity. She's a true expert in this area. Today, Felicity will be talking about the data collected and how this national initiative has the potential to accelerate autism discovery research to improve the lives of people on the spectrum. So I'm going to get out of here and you can hear from the expert. I'd like to welcome Dr. Felicity Rose.
Thank you, Andrew. So thanks for that, Andrew. As Andrew just said, my name is Felicity Rose. I work for the Autism CRC as a project coordinator. One of the projects I've had the absolute privilege and pleasure to help coordinate is the Australian Autism Biobank, and that's what I'll be giving a bit of an overview about today. So, sorry, I'll just try and click. Oh yeah, here we go to the next slide. So on this first slide, it's just the Australian Autism Biobank. It's a national initiative to accelerate autism discovery research. And just on that front slide there, we've got just some of the many organisations who were absolutely integral to getting this project off the ground. And further in the presentation, I'll discuss some of the roles that these organisations and their many staff members had. Just as a bit of an overview for my talk, I'll just give a sort of a background of the rationale of why the Australian Autism Biobank came about as a project. Secondly, a description of what actually happened in the biobank and the data and samples that are there. And thirdly, a description on how you as the research community can access those samples and how we will be getting projects in and also disseminating to the broader community the findings that are made. So, what's the rationale for the biobank? I guess there's 2 rationales there, the scientific and the strategic rationale for having an Australian Autism Biobank. So, Scientifically, our understanding of autism has changed very much over the last 30 years. Before starting the Biobank project, it was becoming very clear to many people in the research and the autism communities that research needed to move away from researching autism as a group, autism as a catch-all. Back then, studies were based on a diagnosis, mostly in young children and generally boys. So the acknowledgement is that there needs to be larger groups with a lot more detailed individual information, not just a diagnosis, a representation of genders, hopefully age groups, and also with biological samples to give us a complete picture. So it's really moving from understanding groups to understanding individuals. And to do scientific justice to the research, that's what we need to be able to do. The strategic rationale for having a biobank is it's around resourcing. Money is scarce, and participants and their time is very valuable. So the idea was to create a large resource, a detailed resource, and really to encourage collaboration through that resource. So that will hopefully allow Australians and internationally to ask impactful research questions with meaningful outcomes. So the Australian Autism Biobank. The aim is to establish a large-scale repository of detailed phenotypic and biological information about children on the autism spectrum. So phenotypic being detailed behavioural, developmental and physical. So what that actually looks like is, here on this slide you can see, the research assistants in this project, of which there were many, did face-to-face assessments with children and with their parents. Parents filled in many questionnaires. Physical and clinical characteristics were taken, and then also biological samples. So all of the phenotypic information was collated, entered, and that was a large undertaking to form a database, and the biological samples were processed and stored for future use. So in Australia, that actually looks like this. So these were our participating institutes and partners, and the Biobank was collecting samples from all across Australia. So in Perth, there was the University of Western Australia and Telethon Kids Institute. Melbourne, we had La Trobe University. Sydney, there was the University of New South Wales and the Sydney Children's Hospital Network. And in Brisbane, the Mater Research collected samples. So two main issues with even just looking at that map. As you can see, Australia is a very vast geographical area. So we had time and we had temperature to combat when doing this project. And it was actually the University of Queensland, also in Brisbane, who processed all the samples. All of the samples collected were.
Can you try to talk to here? The sound apparently is not.
Oh, the sound's not so good. My apologies. So the University of Queensland processed all the samples that we had, and then these were shipped to the Wesley Medical Research Institute for long-term storage. So who participated in the Biobank? We had obviously children who are on the spectrum and one or both biological parents if possible. Their non-autistic siblings also participated. We had another group of children who had been queried whether they were on the spectrum but didn't meet diagnostic criteria, and obviously as you're moving from autism as a group to looking at individuals, it's very important to autism isn't necessarily black and white, but just those grey areas as well. And then children who had no family history of autism and were not autistic themselves as controls. And for the Biobank, there was no exclusion criteria regarding language level, cognitive ability, or co-occurring conditions. So this is where we ended up in terms of participants. There, as you can see, there were 1,152 children on the autism spectrum who participated. That we also had 847 mothers, 548 biological mothers, 263 non-autistic siblings, 150 non-autistic non-family history controls, and 16 children who had been queried whether they were on the autism spectrum. So that's actually almost 3,000 participants, and it was exactly 4,500 biological samples, which was an absolute, a fantastic outcome for the Biobank. The collection of the samples finished at the end of June in 2018. And all of the data and curating the samples was finished by December last year. So what did those people actually contribute in terms of the phenotypic information? There was a vast amount of information collected on these participants. We have a family history questionnaire, which is a very detailed developmental information for the child, information on both biological parents, and also history of pregnancy and all sorts of things. So anything you could think of to ask was in that family history questionnaire. It was very grateful to all the families for filling out something so detailed. There's also the child's communication checklist, which parents report on a child's communication ability. Then we had the adults version of the same thing, where the parents actually rate each other's communication ability. The Biobank is a parent report of functional ability. A short sensory profile is the parent reported measure of how their children respond to sensory events. We also had an eating survey. Of the biological samples that were collected, we didn't just collect blood, there was also urine, stool and hair. And of course, if you're looking for information from a stool sample, you absolutely need to be able to take into account what goes in to understand what comes out. So we have an eating survey for everybody who contributed a stool sample. Then we did intelligence scales on parents and on the children, either a Mullins or a WISC, depending on the age of the children. Clinical measurements, physical and sexual development. And we also had a 3DI, which is a parent interview. It's very detailed. It covers everything from communication, maybe motor development, to self-injurious behaviour. So there's a lot of background information on these participants. Something very important is the ADOS here, which is actually an instrument to diagnose and assess autism. So this was completed face-to-face by our trained research assistants. It's a structured and semi-structured tasks. And in terms of the validity of the whole biobank and research reliability, it's a very valuable measure to have on all the children in the study. On the spectrum, for children, either siblings or controls who weren't, they did a social responsive, or their parents filled out a social responsiveness scale. The biological samples collected, after spending a number of hours in preparation beforehand to fill out all of the phenotypic information, our participants also we're very grateful to get biological samples as well. So a big difference between the Australian Autism Biobank and a number of other large biological sample collections internationally is that we collected blood samples as opposed to saliva samples. So blood samples mean that we've got genetic information on all the participants, as well as storage of plasma and serum, which is important in terms of circulating factors and things like that. We also have a subset of participants with RNA collected. We do have a small proportion of children who couldn't provide a blood sample, and so we do have a subset who provided saliva as an alternative. So you can see there the number of samples that we've got from child participants and adult participants. Children, we did ask if they could provide hair, urine and stool as well, and the numbers of those samples collected, I guess, is an indication of how easy it was to collect those samples as well. So if you want any more detail regarding the actual protocols for the collection of these biological samples, a paper has been published and is available. That will come up in some later slides, or you can just send an email to the Biobank email address and we can give you that if you'd like some more detailed information. So just to break down a little bit more about the type of people who, or the participants in the Biobank. As you can see, the majority of children who participated were primary school age, but there's a good representation of preschool and also high school aged participants as well. Importantly, this is just a histogram that's broken down of the participant types by age. So obviously there's some variability there, which we'd expect, but we do have sort of largely matching program siblings and controls throughout the Biobank, which is important for age matching in controls for certain studies. Sex at birth. So this was relatively as we would expect. We've got the expected ratio in the controls and the siblings, and also on the spectrum there was almost just over a fifth of the participants were females. So one of the advantages of the Biobank is that given the number of participants, even though only a fifth of the autistic participants are females, this still means that there's over 250 children on the spectrum with phenotypic biological samples in the Biobank. So that's absolutely just fabulous as a resource available, because we know that the diagnosis, the developmental trajectory and outcomes for women and girls on the spectrum is something that needs a lot more investigation. So we've got ethnicity, so that's broadly representative of the Australian population. But one thing we do know is that we were recruiting at capital cities, so we won't have a particularly, although some people did travel quite a long way, but in terms of geography for all of Australia, it will be pretty centred around the capital cities, which is fine, and I guess that's one of the flip sides of having such detailed and face-to-face assessments. So this is the detailed study protocol that I'm just popping up at the moment. If you want to know any more about the information or data that is able to be accessed through the Australian Autism Biobank, we are accepting applications for access at the moment. The Biobank is open for applications. It's a resource, it's a pool of data, biological samples for researchers. And the wonderful thing about the Biobank is that it's an enduring asset. So it will sort of continue on, not just as a one-off research project. It's important to note that the Biobank was developed using through cooperation of many research institutes and also participation by the autistic community, and we expect it to be used with cooperation as well. Any requests for access will come through the Autism CRC Access Committee, which has representatives from the autistic community, from the CRC, and from parents as well. Any applications will be subject to cost recovery, which obviously it's an expensive thing to, or it costs money to administer an asset like this, and so that will help us make sure the data is available now and also into the future. If you would like to make an application, you can download a form at the web address at the bottom. We're hoping to get a really broad range of projects that may be supported by the Biobank, anything from diagnosis to better supports, co-occurring conditions. So it'll be exciting to see as more and more applications come through. And just just to sort of close really importantly on that application form, there are two questions that really need to be addressed, and one is the proposed method of publication. The Biobank really needs it to be highlighted how these findings will be communicated with the autistic and autism communities, and also what is the benefit of the research project to the autism community, whether it be people on the spectrum, families, carers, service providers, or policymakers. So if I can just acknowledge, and there's so many names on this slide and so many organisations, there's probably, there's probably others as well. So thank you to all of the research assistants, the sample processes, storage, the PIs, and if I can just highlight Dr. Gail Alvarez here. She's been very instrumental in being a postdoc working on this project, and she's currently presenting a poster on the characteristics of the Australian Autism Biobank over in Montreal, I think it is, at the INSA conference. So good things are already starting to come out of this. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Felicity, for that. That's a fantastic presentation that describes really one of the most powerful resources we have in autism research in Australia. We're really, really thankful to all of those people who helped us create this wonderful resource. Okay, so just a reminder to everyone that if you do have questions for our presenters, and I'm sure there are many, please do type them in the question pane and we'll go over them at about 20 past the coming hour. So our next speaker is Professor Valsamma Eapen. Valsamma is the Autism CRC Program 1 Director, which means she oversees all of the research and operations for our diagnosis and early years program. In addition to being a child psychiatrist, Valsa is an absolute stalwart of the Autism CRC and one of the CRC's greatest assets. In addition to her role with the CRC, Valsa is the Chair of Infant, Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the University of New South Wales, UNSW, and is also head of the Academic Unit of Child Psychiatry at the South West Sydney Local Health District. Now, today, Valsa will be talking about two topics. The first is about supporting kids and their families as they transition to school, and also the science behind some of the recommendations. Oh, and then also Valsa will also be talking about how we can use neuroimaging techniques to better understand brain development in kids on the spectrum and how that knowledge can improve outcomes for kids. Without further ado, here's Valsa.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for the introductions, and thank you everyone for joining during the holiday season. I'm going to briefly mention a study that we undertook through the Autism CRC about how we can support families and children during that very important time point in their life, that's the transition to school. That project actually sits within the subtyping program of the Autism CRC, and that project is about what would work for whom and why. And we all know that autism is highly variable, and there is that variability between different interventions, between children receiving the same intervention. So the question is, how can we understand individual child profile, given that one size does not fit all, and get that understanding to guide us in supporting them, whether it is during transition to school or whether it is in finding the right type of intervention, etc. I'll give you an example of why that profile is important. We talk about the goal or intention of our behaviors. If you can imagine me pouring water from a jug and one of you were to hold out a cup, you haven't told me anything, but I understand the intention is that you want water too. So sometimes we may not be speaking much or saying much, but it may be communicated in different ways and shapes and forms. So within the profile of children with autism, we believe it is important, therefore, to understand in a much deeper way the characteristics or the capabilities, the strengths, as well as the difficulties that children may have, so that we can support them adequately. And that may be about individual child characteristics. It may be the type of intervention we provide, could be matched as well, and what would be the role of the family and the psychosocial factors in it, and also the biological underpinning of what we all carry with us as the constitutional makeup of who we are. So all that will need to come together in determining the clinical presentation and our support for those presentations. In the subtyping project, we did that program through the 6 autism-specific early learning and care centers across Australia, 1 in each state, the AIOU in Queensland, Anglicare in South Australia, the Burnie ASELCC in Tasmania, the Western Australian ASELCC, the KU Children's Services ASELCC in New South Wales, and the La Trobe ASELCC in Melbourne, Victoria. And we already were collecting entry profile of the children as the children walk into these intervention centers for receiving the program. We needed to understand what they are coming with. And then we looked at their exit profile as they left the program. And for the transition to school program, we followed them up into school as well. So we had the autism symptom profile, we had their cognitive level, we had their behavioral profile, adaptive behaviors as well as maladaptive behaviors, both the Vineland and the Mullen. We also had measures on the sensory profile. So we had an idea of what the different characteristics that the children came with and how they left, including what improvements they had been made. So it was then able to follow it up with the transition to school program, which we added on during one of the years in 2016. Children transitioned in 2017. We followed them in the kindergarten, and year 1 was the idea. So in addition to all the child clinical characteristics assessments that we did for their functional levels, their intellectual levels or cognitive ability, their autism related symptoms, child behavior checklist for their behavior profile, Vineland for functional. We also did the parent and teacher child behavior checklist after they transitioned into school. So it was in the end of term 1, early term 2, so that the teachers had an opportunity to get to know the child to be able to complete the CBCL. Teachers and parents also completed the social skills improvement system scale, rating scale, and also the teacher rating scale of school adjustment. So we had a pretty good idea of, in addition to their cognitive autism functional levels, how they were adjusting to the school situation, how they were participating in the school situation, etc. And this is where they transitioned into. About 39% was mainstream schools, 18% was mainstream schools and special, so they had a split attendance. Then there were 11% with the autism special units within mainstream schools, so on and so forth. And about 4% were homeschooled. And as you would see here, the experience of starting the school, as parents reported, about 7% said not very good, 11% just okay, fairly good was 41%, and very good was 41%. So pretty much they were happy with that transition process and the experiences, so which is very encouraging. And then when we looked at how they were faring within the classrooms, based on the teacher rating scales and the parent rating scales, we found that in general, that dictated the success in school outcomes. So probably it's not a great deal of surprise there if you have got good expressive language and the Mullen showing good cognitive ability. They had better participation in the classrooms. Communication skills, particularly on the Vineland, which is more about the functional communication rather than the cognitive understanding, that was associated with cooperative participation in classroom. Visual reception, fine motor skills, receptive expressive language were associated with the comfort level, how comfortable they were with the classroom teacher. So the language ability, the way you are able to communicate your needs and wants, as well as the adaptive behavior, seems to be very important in successful transition. And we always had a hypothesis that much more than the symptoms of autism, it would be how well they can cope and adapt and be flexible within the classroom setting would really dictate the success with the transition. Sometimes we hear stories that yes, it is not so much the autism symptoms, but it is the behavior that is preventing them from integrating in the classrooms or being able to be managed in mainstream settings. So we really found that to be the case from the data that we collected as well. So the next project was to have something then to be developed that would support parents and teachers during that very important transition phase. And that led to the development of this resource. There are the guidelines for parents, and we also developed the guidelines for professionals. That's a transition to school guidelines. It's available on the Autism CRC website, and it's easily available free of cost. And again, transition to school is arguably one of the most important events that would be happening for a young person diagnosed to be having autism. And therefore, it is extremely important that we do all what we can to support them during that very important time point in their life. And what's involved in transition to school in a nutshell, there is an initial planning process, and it stretches to about 6 to 12 months, and it has to be a collaborative approach. And then you have a very detailed individualized transition plan that you develop. You do a lot of active preparation by going, doing visits, exploring the classroom, going, visiting again, etc. And then once the school has started, it's important to continue to support them and evaluate what's working, what's not working. And that follow-up support and evaluation is equally important as well. So in that initial planning, it's really to have almost a team around transition. And the team should be created. And the team, when you create that team, it definitely will have the parents and the guardians. You'll also want an advocate or an interpreter or a support worker if the family is in any way needing that extra support. The place from where the child is transitioning out, for example, in our case, it was the Early Learning Care Center, the ASELCCs, which were providing the early intervention for them. So the staff member who knew the child over that year providing intervention was integral part of that team. Early childhood intervention professionals, if there were anyone other than the center-based intervention, they were receiving any other interventions or any other professionals involved, let them come on into the team as well. And the transition coordinator or a case manager, some departments of education would provide that in some states, but not everyone has that. But the team would definitely be consisting of all those people who are important in the child's life. And after you have identified the right school for the child, then the school staff would get involved. So that would be the school teacher, the school counselor, the principal, depending on the situation and how much flexibility the new school has in terms of being involved. And then you have a transition timeline. As I said, we have just now started for preparing for that process of transitioning to children at the end of this year already. And the funding needs to be sorted, the program eligibility into what type of setting they are going into needs to be determined. Support staff who are needed will need to be lined up, or at least the funding to be sought for that, and then making a really formal transition plan. So the transition plan should contain everything about the child's characteristics, and some of these assessments became very important and integral part of that plan because we knew what their cognitive level is, what their behavioral strengths and challenges are, whether they had any sensory issues, what their likes and dislikes are, what would suit them, what would trigger them. All that information goes into the transition plan, and your child's ability to, in respect to organizing information or being able to cooperate, all that is taken into consideration. And if they have any special interests, that would motivate them. Special challenges if they have, special fears if they have, how would they normally respond to those kind of uncertainties, or a storm or a lightning or a whatever is their fear, what usually happens, how would they respond, how you can respond to support them. All that becomes part and parcel of that individual transition plan. And again, in the school readiness skills, communication means whether they need visual aids, How do they indicate when they need to use the bathroom, toilet? How do they unwrap lunch? Do they have the ability to do this, that? So it's a very, very detailed transition plan. And once that's done, you're beginning to actively prepare the child to start school. So it's about creating a basic daily schedule, almost mimicking how it would be when they start school. So dressing, getting dressed, and toileting, packing school bag, eating from a lunch box. You kind of almost do it before you get to school as a practice run, if you like, and practicing as much as you can, as many skills as you can in a variety of locations will really help with that success once they hit the ground with the new school. Again, encouraging communication, whether it is showing cards or indicating through other means, if they use an iPad or other technology, if they use, all that becomes part of that story. And social stories are often used in that setting, as we all know, about daily routine, about making friends, about fun activities that they might encounter when they get to school. So all that becomes part of the active preparation. Now, preparing the child is one thing, but preparing the family and preparing the classroom, the staff, and the school is yet another thing. And all these three components have to happen. And preparing the family also means that they have the opportunity to visit the school on a number of occasions, if that's possible, exploring the actual classroom in which the child would be in, doing it together with your child, and developing some kind of a support network of families or previous parents who have been in that school who can give you a helping hand. All that kind of becomes very handy. And the early intervention center from where we transitioned the children, that the staff from those intervention centers were very, very key in successful transition, because they could transfer all the knowledge they had about the child and what would work for them, all that to the new class situation, to the new school, and to the teacher. So sending that support worker or a key worker or an early intervention teacher into the new school with the child and the family seemed to be very helpful as well. And then there was the receiving teacher visit. If the teacher who was going to receive the child could come and see the child in the early intervention center before the transition happened, just to see how they were managing within the early intervention center, was sometimes also very helpful if the new school and the teachers have the ability and the flexibility to be able to do that. All that would be very good. And preparing the class, again, modifying the classroom situation if there is anything required in that regard, how delivering the instructions should happen, having a communication book between all the settings. So definitely the family, the child, the classroom, all that needs to be taken into account. Now, once the school has started, we don't just say that's it. The transition team would continue to meet again, either by phone, by being available, even if they didn't have any formal appointments for those kind of meetings. Just being available and knowing that that person is available was very useful for the receiving teacher to know that they can touch base on. And we had a team meeting at the end of term 1 just to review how the processes were happening. And at that time, we were also concentrating on skill maintenance and the development of new skills, and how behaviors and engagement are going, and how we might be able to improve motivation or attention or any self-regulation issues that if they were there. Similarly, social skills, communication skills, interactions with other peers, and how it was going, and if there were anything that we could do to enhance that, was part of the conversation when we had that post-transition to school meeting at the end of term 1. The resource also has a lot of useful websites and resources, for example, social story examples that one can do. There are some routine visual schedule examples there as well that one can use. So really it's about preparing the child, the family, preparing the school, then engaging the services that have been involved prior, and engaging the community together for the successful transition. So very quickly moving on to the next talk, if you like, on how we have used functional near-infrared spectroscopy, a type of imaging of the brain, as a tool to understand subgroups. And we all know that the biology of autism, or the way the brain is wired, might be in such a way that children are not interested in socially rewarding interactions, or in playing with other people, or interacting with other people. So usually what happens when your biology or your brain wiring is such that you're not interested in these things, children normally would get left out of the social milieu or the social loop. Children usually learn by imitation, by mimicking most of the things in the very early life before we even start teaching them anything. So being part of that social loop, social milieu, and observational learning is mostly how learning happens in early years. But because autism and the brain is wired in a particular way that you are less interested in that, you get more and more drifting out of the social milieu of learning, or the social loop of learning, which in turn cascades into them not being able to develop those skills which you so dearly need and want. And we know from the science of early childhood and brain development that initially when you're born, you have got very little connections for the brain networks. But the synapses start to develop, the axons start to branch with the dendrites, they form connections, and by the time you are in the second, third year of life, it's so densely connected. And from 4 years onwards, we are actually pruning them away. Things that you don't need, only the things that you really need and you use will be retained, and the rest just gets pruned out. So it is so very important to utilize that plasticity of the brain to make those connections during that first 3 years of life, for us to be able to get in and make a difference, or make as much of a potential in terms of wiring and networking and the connectivity to be forming within the brain in those years. So understanding the unique profile of each child becomes extremely important in giving the right intervention, if you like. So we believe that using neuroimaging techniques like the one I'm going to talk about a bit more is near-infrared spectroscopy. People also use the magnetic resonance imaging, which is more of a structural part of the aspects of the brain imaging. Then we can also use eye tracking, EEG, evoked response potential, etc. And there are a number of studies that have looked at neurocognitive aspects of children with autism, and what we find is, for example, with the evoked response potential, normally a particular component of the ERP called N170 is larger when you are seeing faces, and it's prominent over the right hemisphere. But in those with autism spectrum type features, what we find is larger for non-face, like that becomes more prominent when you are seeing a furniture or something of an object toy that's of interest to them than a familiar face. And if you look at fMRI, that's functional magnetic resonance imaging activation, when you show cartoon figures, amygdala and the fusiform face area, activation is the same in young children with autism and in typically developing children. But when you show them a familiar face, that differentiation, you can see that the fusiform face area is not activated in the way that you would like it to when you are watching or seeing a familiar face on the screen. So the whole idea of this project was to see whether we can see whether the children are more social brain oriented or object brain oriented. What was the level of social brain activity or flickering in the brain that was available to them, so that we can target the intervention accordingly. So you're seeing that you can compare the relationship between the behavioral assessments and what we are seeing in terms of the brain activity when you show them a social stimulus. This is a video clip where a lady is singing "Wheels on the Bus Go Round and Round Nursery Wrong" with a lot of facial emotions and a lot of gesturing and everything. and the other non-social or object-oriented stimuli is a spinning toy. So what we want to know is that what part of the brain is getting activated when children are watching these videos. And this is how we did it. The difference between an MRI scanner and a functional near-infrared spectroscopy is that all you have is something like a swimming cap on your head with some electrodes stuck onto it. It's portable. It is easy to set up. You don't need to go into big MRI machines, but we can get to see what the dehemodynamic activity of the brain is like. So here you're seeing that red activation of the frontal areas, and the red means it's more activity, and then the temporal frontal area. So social versus toy, we can see what area of the brain is being activated when children are watching this on the screen. And that's the temporal parietal area lighting up, and they're seeing the object toys. So this is how it would look like. The child sits in front of a screen with the cap on, and they are seeing the video being played, which is of the nursery rhyme being sung or the object toy. And we then can have a better understanding of how much of social brain activity is available to the child, based on how the parts of the brain that activated when they were watching that social stimuli of the nursery rhyme lady. And what we found here is that normally you would expect a lot of frontal front part anterior activity, but you're not seeing much of a red at all when you are seeing that social lady singing. But when you see the object toy, you see that the posterior part, the visual part, is activated here. And here is a comparison in terms of what we see during fMRI. The red spot that's circled signaling you are perceiving the face. That's a fusiform face area, showing the activity that yes, you are perceiving that face. And the blue is activation of the non-face objects. What you see in control subjects is both the red and the blue actives, that is, you're perceiving both the face correctly using the fusiform face area, and you are correctly perceiving the non-face as well. But in the autism child, with the one on the right, the child with the features of autism, you are seeing that there is no red signal at all. The fusiform face area is totally not activated. So what we see as social brain versus object-oriented brain, there is a lot of gradations of that. So if somebody has got reasonably well social affect scores on an ADOS, and if we find that they have got good activation on the fMRI and the NERS when they are watching that social stimuli being played, you can be pretty confident that the intervention using social sensory routines and motivating them through that area of the brain is a good possibility. But if you are very object oriented and the only parts of the brain that are coming alive is that object oriented parts of the brain, then probably your intervention should be more modeling that type of learning teaching paradigms. So we ended up with 3 subgroups based on morphological understanding. One was larger brain of the frontal lobe area, smaller brain in the temporal parietal. And clinically, they had higher nonverbal but lower social skills. Then the group 2 had smaller brain regions across the board. They had lower nonverbal and lower social scores. And group 3 had larger brain regions in general, and they had higher nonverbal and high social scores. So again, the idea of the subtyping program is to understand what unique profile each child has, and also other children who have that similar profile. Can we group them together so that we can provide the right intervention, the right supports, and that can also come into play in the transition to school support as well. So again, having that better understanding and a deeper understanding of how your brain is activated, how your behavioral profile and your cognitive level and everything else that the family and the support and the environment is providing to you can be all optimized. And we all know that biology is just the starting point. Biology is not destiny. It's really the learning opportunities through the synapse-dependent activity formation and those parts of the brain being activated time and again through interactions, through intervention, through matching, through modeling, and repetitively doing that, that we make those connections to come alive. And so everyday activities that children engage in across their day are building a more social communicative brain or a more object-oriented brain. And those who are less interested in the social aspects of life, how can we optimize during that very early first 3 years of life for the brain to connect in a way that would make it more a social brain, communicative brain as they move forward from then onwards, because that plasticity is so much available to you. So that's probably how we should be supporting each and every individual who has got symptom signs of autism. Understanding the heterogeneity is very much part of that and the critical step in tailoring the interventions. And definitely it is not just about explaining to the families, but also we can provide the right supports, utilizing their strengths, what they are good at, what will motivate them. That should be our main thing that we foster when we are looking at transition to school. So they all have the right to optimum management, and better understanding will clearly help us to provide the right supports for the right child in the right setting at the right time, hopefully early enough. Thank you.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Valsa, and also thank you again to Felicity for sharing their research, but also their experience. I certainly got a lot out of that. I'm sure others did as well. We've got a couple of minutes for questions, and a few questions have been sent our way. And I'll actually turn to the Biobank first, to Felicity, and just to give Valsa a bit of a rest. So, Felicity, the first question was with regards to twins within the Biobank. Do you have a sense of how many sets of twins we have? And if you don't, I do. So I'll give you the chance to answer first. You're on mute, Felicity. Yeah. Okay. Look, I do have a sense of how many sets of twins there. So with, I don't have the zygosity of the twins, so whether they're identical or fraternal, but there are 18 sets of twins where both of the children have a diagnosis of autism. There's 12 sets of twins where one has a diagnosis of autism and the other doesn't. So that's 30 sets of twins in total. But the important thing to also say is that we also have many families in which there are multiple children affected. I believe all the way up to a family where there were 5 children who had a diagnosis of autism and provided biological samples. So, and every wonderful shade of humanity in between, let me assure you. So, lots of possibilities there. Felicity, if you're back on now, we've had a question about what types of analyses have already been conducted on the biological samples. And what has been found. And so I can answer that first bit. The answer is none, because this is very fresh, but maybe Felicity can talk a little bit about the project that's been commissioned through the University of Queensland.
I'm not sure, can you hear me again now?
Yes.
Sure, okay, so if I can, the question just about the type of biological investigations, particularly yes. Hair testing. So just to go to the hair testing, as Andrew said, we haven't done any yet. It's all sitting there waiting to be requested by people who might have a project around that. My understanding is that you know, the collection of hair is primarily around looking at cortisol levels and things like that. But in the future, I'm sure there's, you know, a whole area of work in terms of metabolomics of hair. It's a very stable marker. So, you know, we look forward to receiving any projects around that. Yeah. In terms of the biological investigations that have been approved so far. There has been one commissioned or approved through the University of Queensland using genetic data and also phenotypic data, and looking at, I guess, sort of diagnostic protocols. Early and more accurate intervention would be the goal there. So we're waiting and working with the researchers there in terms of their findings, so that'll be quite exciting.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, really early days with regards to, we've just finalised the collection and then receiving applications. So certainly very keen to see further applications received as well. Look, we've got time for one final question, and I'm going to ask this question of Valsa. Valsa, this is almost a $64,000 question. How far, I mean, what steps do we need to take to get to a point where we are advising therapeutic choices based on biology? It's a holy grail in autism to better tailor treatment to the individual in front of us. I love that idea, not least because it makes us see beyond the label autism and look at this wonderful human in front of us. How far away are we from adapting our therapies, not just to meet the behavioural needs of that individual and cognitive needs, but also the biological needs? And what steps do we need to take?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard one to say, but I mean, there are opportunities for very small subgroups where there are very specific genetic type of involvement. And we know that more and more those ones are coming up, and we are understanding a whole heap more of very small fractions. That's where the problem is. You've got hundreds of small type deletions or very specific changes that is determining. But the numbers, when you put into the whole mix, it's still only about 10 to 15% of cases where you have that kind of very specific stuff. Because the majority are talking about the common variations which go a hit and a miss and a polygenic with environmental influences. But the more of an opportunity that I see away from that, Rett syndrome, for example, is one of those which originally we counted everyone as probably just autism features with intellectual disability. But then we began to identify Rett syndrome as Rett syndrome, and which then means the cause and the prognosis and the treatment might be slightly different to them. So that kind of emerging syndromes would continue to happen, but that is a very small subset, even with all of them included. But what I see more and more happening would be that if there are very specific oxytocin receptor gene being just one fancy example, just because it's easy to describe. If we find that there is definite pathway coming from the oxytocin receptor gene, maybe we would do things slightly differently for that subgroup, is another way of looking at it. It may be that it's to do with the serotonin system.
Yeah.
So then we would look at that slightly differently. So that's all one way of biologically looking at it. But I also see a lot of merit in that neurocognitive understanding. That's biological too, your biological ways in which your brain is wired. So if you have got somebody with really object-oriented brain, fascinated at objects, would be a great nuclear physicist, we should tap that. No, great nuclear physicist, rather than sing and dance around them and say that their social skills should come up. So that's where I see more value in subtyping and subgrouping and adding to the strengths and seeing what would tick them, what would make them tick, what would really get them to be motivated to learn in their own way of learning. What are their strengths? So I see a lot of value biologically, neurocognitively in determining those aspects of strengths, those aspects of uniqueness, which we really can utilize, which we are not doing much of.
Yeah. Thanks, Val. So I think that was a fabulous answer, and I would agree. I think that we now have all of the tools, which we didn't have before, to start measuring these things. It's now what we do with that information, and I think that's the great promise of these coming years. Look, we're at time, everyone. I just wanted to say thank you so much to you all, firstly, for attending, and to Felicity and Valsa for their time and their presentations. We really do appreciate what you've been able to do for us today. This year's webinar series has been extremely popular and all sessions are full. If you'd like to share today's webinar, we'll be placing a recording of this on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, Autism CRC. We'll share this recording on our website through our regular social media channels like Facebook and Twitter, most likely next week. If you'd like to know more about the Autism CRC's work across the lifespan, please just visit our website, where you can all sign up for the e-news and participate in some of our studies. You can, of course, all follow us on social media. So once again, thank you so much for attending today. I hope you have a lovely holiday tomorrow, and we'll no doubt see you all soon. Thanks again. Bye-bye.